Good afternoon. My name is Shama Banerjee. I am the editor at Nimbus 90, and a warm welcome to you joining our webinar series, Chief Disruptor Insights. This is the second episode of a two-part series where we endeavour to make sense of the year ahead, how businesses should prepare for it, and also to answer the question, what is there to be optimistic about in 2021? I'm delighted to welcome our panellists for today, Laurie Beck, who is the former VP of Consumer Insights at COTY, and Neil Roberts, who is the Chief Product Officer at Papier. And they will be sharing their thoughts on what 2020 is going to look like for businesses and how to lay the path for recovery ahead. Thanks so much for joining us both.
Great to be here, thanks. Virtually, obviously.
It's great to be here, thank you.
So before we dive in, just a reminder that if you haven't joined us before, part of this discussion, there will also be a Q&A. So you can use the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen. It should be quite clear where that is. If you have a question at any time, please do just add that into that box. We will have time allocated at the end to get through as many as we can, but also we'll try and weave them through the discussion as we go. So do put questions in as and when they come to you. So to kick off, I'd love to ask our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves. So Neil, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Neil Roberts. I started out originally as a developer many years ago and spent a big chunk of the early 2000s working in the digital transformation for Eurostar. So leading all of the digital products that they had, website, app, onboard entertainment and all of those sorts of things. I left there to join Moo as a product director for moo.com, and more recently in lockdown. So in September this year, I joined Papier as the CPO, and Papier is part of the Sunday Times Fast Track high growth businesses. So actually we've been doing quite well over the last 12 months, which is probably not the common story that's been happening for everybody else.
Thanks, Neil. And we'll be diving into some of that in a bit. Laurie, I'd love you to introduce yourself as well.
Hi there. Thanks so much, and thank you for inviting me along. So I have been in consumer insights throughout my career, both on the agency side, and that's the likes of Nielsen and Kantar, but primarily on client side in consumer goods. So ranging from soft drinks to household products to healthcare to personal care. And most recently, looking after the consumer insight for COTY. For those who don't know, COTY is in the beauty industry with a focus on cosmetics and fragrance. So unlike what Neil was saying about Papier, as you can imagine, your two biggest occasions for cosmetics and fragrance is getting ready for work in the morning and for socializing. So obviously COVID has had a marked impact on that category, all those categories overall. But great to be here.
Thanks, Laurie. So to dive into the conversation, 2020, we obviously saw huge changes for many industries, many organizations. What do you both think are those changes that will really have the biggest long-term impacts, both for businesses, but also for society as a whole? Laurie, if I could come to you first.
Sure. So I think when I look at it, we're right in the middle of the storm at the moment. So there is optimism. There certainly is optimism thanks to some vaccines, but we're still going through a lot of it at the moment. And I think we also have a tendency, all of us, to overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. So I'll give you my thoughts in terms of what I believe, but also some of them is what I hope. So if we look at it from a society first, I think this is we've all revalued our networks, our relationships, and our connections. You know, it's the simple things really that matter that suddenly we're not able to do, meeting up with people, etc. But it's also given us the chance to revalue some people in terms of the work they do. Obviously, the NHS, that goes without saying, but teachers, hospitality. Even to our hairdressers, that particularly in the first lockdown, we all took pretty dramatic, all found pretty dramatic solutions. So I think one of them I would hope also continues is the focus on quality versus quantity. That's in terms of what we do, but also how we consume. One of the other areas linked to that is human kindness. We've seen a lot of response, the most latter being around make a difference. The response to needs and how people have responded, which in times of crisis is always reassuring to see. And I do hope that human kindness generally continues. Unfortunately, history hasn't proved that out, but we can always hope. One of the areas that I think we should all keep a watch out for from a society perspective is if we look at the generations, particularly we look at millennials and then we look at Gen Z, there's been an increase in, I'm going to say, the underlying anxiety, risk aversion, and that's because of what they were born into. If you look now at the toddlers, which, I mean, there are many different names, but let's go with the Alpha, Generation Alpha. We look at toddlers right now, they're not able to socialize and they're not able to interact in the way that they have been before. So depending on how long this continues, we need to see how that actually really plays out in terms of what are those drivers and what are those impacts on society. The other side that you mentioned was the business side. So there's always been, and increasingly is the demand for flexibility and change, now more than ever. Just embracing that, whether that is around organization, whether that's around resources, supply, obviously cost management is absolutely essential. And the other area that this is really posed is that in previous, whether it's health crises or financial crises, we've been able to balance between geographies, which is not the case right now. But actually, there's still a demand for a balance and everyone to look at how they balance their business. Now, that is where they show up, channels, so that in my business, and particularly from a cosmetics perspective, we're still very focused on retail and bricks and mortar. So really driving up that online and even the D2C side, and as much as possible, and where you can, to balance out your categories, and still a degree of geographies, because we've seen some rebounding. So for example, China rebounding much quicker. That's obviously if you can. So those are the things that I think and I hope, as I said, will continue to play out.
Definitely. And I would love to pick out the one thing you just said there, which was underestimating the short term and overestimating the long term. I think that's a really interesting idea. Neil, what are your thoughts on the changes that you saw in 2020? Obviously, you mentioned at the beginning that it had a big impact on your business in terms of growth, which is kind of the opposite of what lots of people have seen. So if you could share some of that story.
Yeah, well, I think it was a tale of two halves for me and for Papier as well. So I think initially, so I was working at the start of the pandemic. I was starting working with Moo, and predominantly they're a B2B business specialising in printing of business cards. And I doubt there's anybody here that's exchanged a business card in the last 12 months. So that had a big impact on them. And similarly for Papier, a big part of their growth in 2019 and 18 had been weddings, which is another area which isn't really growing at the moment, shrinking and quite erratic. And people's buying behaviour obviously is driven by the rules that are sort of governing us at the moment. So there was a pivot. So that initial period around March and April was a really big shock for the business. And I think Papier has managed to pivot its focus away from what had been a growth engine around weddings into broader stationery categories, which obviously with the high streets being shut has been an area that we've been primarily placed to mop up the demand that is now there that would have been on a physical high street. So I think, yeah, from a business point of view, the size of the company and adaptability has really helped us. Because I think if we hadn't been able to pivot away from weddings, it would have been a very different story. And I think another thing for us as well is sort of adaptability in terms of ways of working internally. You know, the business hadn't even really heard of Zoom in February last year, and now it's all we do. And that is, I think, because we're a London-based business and we haven't had the need for video conferencing really at that point. And so there's quite a big, I suppose, a speeding up of a trend that was happening anyway. in terms of remote working. So I've worked in a lot of businesses over the years where they've been very reluctant to let go of control or visibility of staff, and people have been forced to do that. And I think in some extremes, you've even heard of some of the big consulting companies saying they're going to get rid of some of their big office space and get some big cost reductions. And I think we did have discussions about that sort of stuff earlier in the year. But I think what we've grown to value over the 12 months actually is the balance between the two. So, you know, there is a real benefit from being able to work remotely and sort of close yourself off in terms of life and work balance, but also actually the silence of doing that individual contributor work and actually getting things done without interruptions. But actually what you miss is the social interaction and the informal networks and the relationship building, which actually can make a business work. So I think I don't get a view that for Papier at least that we will go 100% remote. We're very much talking about how can we get the best of both worlds as it moves forward. But that I don't think would have been a trend that would have emerged without the pandemic. And I think the other thing from sort of chats that I've had with sort of friends and people within my network would be around the shift from cities into the regions. So the conversation I'd had with a friend of mine that had been on high street retail and spent a big chunk of his year renegotiating retail rents, and what he was talking about how Oxford Street, you know, they might get 10 people into the store there in Oxford Street, where that would have been the big boom area, but the regional stores were overflowing. And I think with that shift in working patterns, you may see a reinvigoration in regional businesses and regional high streets. But I think it's anyone's guess of what the high street's going to look like in 12 months' time.
Definitely. I think this year is going to show us a lot of new things, really. And just to pick up on the point you made about adaptability, one insight we're seeing currently come out of our digital trends survey, which is a survey we do of our membership every year, is that the majority of respondents are actually agreeing quite strongly with the idea that one, they've become more innovative, and two, they've become more agile in responding to changing environments, changing consumer needs. So I think that's definitely something we've seen pan out over the last 9-10 months. So just quickly to take a pause from this conversation, we're going to run a quick poll. It should pop up on your screens shortly. There it is. So it'd be great if everyone listening, if you could just fill that in. What will be the biggest challenge facing your organization in 2021? And we will share those results in a few minutes. So Laurie and Neil, we've talked a bit about kind of looking back at 2020. What do you think are going to be the major priorities for businesses in 2021? Neil, I'll come to you first for that.
So I was just doing my poll. I think it's the changing, particularly I think for retailers that have been very strong on the retail presence and bricks and mortar side of things is changing to the online side of things and speeding that up. So a lot of the survey, industry-based surveys that I'm seeing, or consumer-based surveys, is indicating that people that probably would never have shopped online a year ago, or perhaps ever, without a pandemic, are now shopping, obviously, because they have to out of necessity. But actually, more interestingly, is they're saying that may be a permanent change in behaviour. So it has, again, sped up that consumer trend of online adoption. So even, you know, my parents, my father in particular, is in his mid-70s. I never thought he would actually use the technology to do the things that I do every day. But he's been forced to, and he is. And I think when I looked at the surveys, we've seen the demographic of our customer base shift in the 12 months to an older demographic, who are people who are now forced to and getting familiar with the technology. So I think that's going to be a massive shift for the bricks and mortar retailers of how they readjust their I suppose logistics distribution. And how they can, I suppose, make a benefit out of the added benefit that they already have a retail infrastructure. I think another thing that we've seen as well is looking at supply chain and how, partly triggered by, I think, people pausing and thinking about the environmental impact of their consumption, but also sort of retail logistics. So it's a big challenge for us actually is it sounds almost arrogant to say at the moment, but it's keeping up with demand. So the demand is there, fulfilling it is the challenge. So it's thinking about looking at local suppliers or in-country suppliers to balance off things coming from China, where the supply chain was getting cut off, or the lead times are considerably longer. So it's a broader consideration than just the unit cost of that, as well as the impact of the environmental impact of that kind of consumption. So I think those things again are being sped up. I mean, I could go back 5 years ago when at Eurostar we were trying to understand whether the environmental impact versus traveling on planes was a big driver of purchasing behavior. And it was a nice to have really when we spoke to consumers. It wasn't a driver of their choice of transport. What we are seeing in the consumer research that we ran late last year was actually increasingly it is something that people are wanting to understand about the products, the provenance of them, and the lasting impact of them, and it is starting to drive behavior. So I think that's something that we'll have to get our heads around and how we do that, because it's not straightforward to remove plastic from from our lives. I've definitely found that personally. So that is going to be something that I think is going to be increasingly important.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think it'll be interesting to see what the poll responses are, because that is certainly one of the options. Laurie, what are your thoughts on how businesses need to be prioritising in 2021?
Yeah, I think a couple of things just to build on what Neil was saying. I think the online and the digital world, I think, is the growth that we've seen is sort of jumped us forward almost decades. In my industry, the growth of the online has been exponential, but it is not sufficient to offset bricks and mortar. So I think there is still a role for bricks and mortar. It's down to, from a retail perspective, what are they offering? What are they offering over and above, obviously, the product? Where's the experience? I think perhaps when you get to fragrance and cosmetics, you actually need to see it, feel it. There are other ways, but it's not quite the same. I think some other things is definitely ruthless prioritization. We're still in the middle of the pandemic. Well, hopefully not the middle, but we're still in it. So I think ruthless prioritization, cash is king, and a lot of companies need to refocus their resources, their suppliers, Neil was saying, even their organization, and make sure that it's right-sized. There is also, I think, a really big focus that needs to be on everyone from a product service perspective, is understanding the foundation. So what are your hero products? What are your hero services? What is the right assortment that you need to have? Where, in terms of the channels? That's still 80% of sales. I come from a lot of my responsibility has always been innovation, which is exciting and new, but you need to do it on a solid base. I think this is also the time for a lot of companies to, particularly in light of supply chain challenges, is refocus on what is absolutely essential that we cannot do without, which very much is on the base business. I also think that this, from 2021 and hopefully also ongoing, one is a focus on people. As we go through this with, we're lucky that we can continue working virtually, but in those environments is to make sure that you support people, your teams. You also communicate so that everyone knows what the priorities are, particularly given that there's still a lot of kinks on the road. What is changing? What does that actually mean? You can't rely on those sort of corridor conversations, of course. And it would be really remiss of me just to say engage with your consumers and your customers. That should have been happening already, but even more so now, that communication is absolutely essential. If you are facing supply chain issues, communicate to people, let them know where you're at, build that degree of trust and authenticity, because that will only set you up for success in the future. So I think there's a lot of, let's cut back to the criticals. Let's be truthful and authentic in all of those touch points along the journey.
Mm-hmm. And that definitely links back to some of the earlier stuff, Neil, you were sharing in terms of, visibility across the organization with people remote working, that loss of social interaction, actually the challenge that business leaders now have to bring that back in with remote working, which is going to be the reality for the next few months. So if possible, could we share the poll results now, bring those up on the screen and we can just have a look. Thank you. Okay, so I think unsurprisingly their recovery from the impact of COVID-19 is number one. Laurie and Neil, any jump out results there for you?
No, I would expect COVID to, of course, be there. I think hopefully it is all recovery. And linked to that, I think the changing work environment for me is quite linked to that, because it's the reality of where we're at. But then also, what do we do, as we all try and race back to normal? What does that actually now get to look like? And I wouldn't want to be a landlord of a lot of commercial properties right now. Of course, it talks to me to say changing consumer behaviors. I think that is something that that is really important to keep a touch on, to keep a track of and monitor what people are doing. There's some things that people are doing as a workaround for today, which is for today. There's some things that we've changed for good. And I think back to Neil's comment about online and people that you wouldn't have expected, or not wouldn't have expected, but people who hadn't used online to shop before, if they've got over the barriers that were in their minds, and the experience has been positive, they'll stick with it. So making sure that we actually really do understand that.
And Neil, some of these results are supporting things that you mentioned earlier. So is there anything that you're surprised by?
No, I don't think so, actually. I think, obviously, I mean, I've got friends that work in the travel industry, so, recovery from the impact of COVID-19, actually, they're more in surviving long enough sort of stage. And I think, potentially being quite pessimistic about how quickly the travel market will recover. So there is that survival mode, but also first thinking is actually you need to prepare from actually when you do make it through, what does that then mean for the how does the business have to change? So yeah, I think very different stories. There are, it seems, in every scenario, it's sort of the winners and losers. And I think there's a lot of the traditional businesses that are, they need to see it through, and then they can start thinking about the future. But yeah, then it comes into, I think, adapting the way the working environment and consumer behaviours are going to be the two biggest triggers. So once you've got past that survival stage, it's then actually, well, what can you do in this period to help prepare in terms of a changing working environment and changing consumer patterns? And I think if that is going to be exceptionally challenging if you don't have the cash flow to start investing in online channels that you perhaps haven't. But I think you will see a shift in more competition online, which we're all going to see. And I think we'll all be on a learning curve, I think, in terms of the changing working environments. How do you replicate some of the things that you get in a physical working environment, those 5-minute chats when you walk around, the water cooler chat or the kitchen chat that really grease the gears of the machine and keep things working, which aren't as visible. So I think more reliance on formal structured communication and cascading that down to people, and working out how to create social interactions through a Zoom or a Slack call or something along those lines, which don't necessarily feel natural to people, but are important, and making sure that people don't feel isolated. And I think something I've seen as well with quite a young workforce is actually, I'm quite lucky, I can take over the kids' playroom, and I've got a quiet space to do that if I dodge the Play-Doh on the floor. But actually for a lot of the younger members of the team, they're in a flat share or something similar, and they don't actually even have a desk that they can work at. So I think that's something that we need to consider as employers, is actually what are we doing for the physical and mental well-being of our teams when they're working at home and don't have the space. And I can see that being a challenge which is quite difficult to manage.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder to everyone listening, just while we pause conversation for a second, there is the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please do be adding questions in to that box, and we will come on to those in a bit. So I think both of you who've talked about the need to be interacting with your consumers and understanding what they need. I think at this time, it's particularly difficult because behaviours are changing so quickly. How should businesses be talking to their customers and continuing their research into consumer insights during this time while maintaining that empathy, Laurie, that you have talked about?
So I think this is actually the perfect time. I have never seen surveys completed as quickly over this pandemic. We are all consumers. So we as people are all at home. We're very willing to share our opinions and our points of view. So actually this is almost the perfect time. And people are being truthful and authentic because they've got nothing to hide. So I think this is firstly, it is always central to bring your consumer, your end user into your business discussions. And I'm not obviously, but I am a passionate advocate of it. But actually consumers are very willing at this point. I think in terms of the engagement, I think it's quite important to understand what is the role of your business or brand, so that you can actually engage in a way that really makes sense, that you're not forcing that conversation. So that could be informational. So if you look at the retailers, they have been really consistent in updating via emails around, what's the shopping protocol, how to manage things as best as possible, and keep people abreast of it. I think from a brand perspective, there's a real opportunity, one, around education. Now that can be a serious education, as in myth busting or how you protect yourself, but it can also be education around new skills or tutorials, because again, people are at home, they're willing to do things that they haven't done before. So I think, again, going back to the category that I was working in cosmetics, while Halloween was of course a non-event, the Halloween makeup was still a really big event because people were at home and they had virtual parties, and there was a lot of tutorials around it that you can play meaningfully. That also is a way to inspire and bring fun, and people are looking for those distractions. So I think understanding, having that connection with consumers, you understand what their needs are, and then you talk to them from their needs rather than from a brand trying to force its point of view and force its presence within consumers' lives. I think it's essential to come from the consumer, and then you're able to build those relationships. But that is something for a here and now, but also ongoing. It gives you such richness of insight and opportunity because they're sharing their data with you, and data really is one of the new wealth, or new currency at least, that I think it's a perfect opportunity if people have not already started it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Laurie. I'm seeing questions coming in. Do keep adding those. But just in terms of, I guess, what businesses might see ahead as well. So we've talked about consumer, we've talked about employees and how to deal with those. This series is that we want to ask, what is there to be optimistic about in 2021? So what do you think businesses have in terms of opportunity and how they might go about addressing those opportunities in the year ahead? Neil, I'll come to you first for that.
Well, I sort of build on Laurie's point actually about the accessibility of sort of customer insight, because similarly it's actually a lot easier in a remote environment to do, well, not necessarily focus groups, but customer interviews, the qualitative things, which actually usually logistically are quite hard because people need to travel in and you want to see, they come into your office and they need to take time out of their day or the working day. That insight is much more accessible. So we've been doing that a lot more consistently and easily, and surveys as well. So I think that is a real shift in terms of the willingness and accessibility to get that customer insight, and also the cost of doing so, which I think is really good. I think it's really challenging because it varies so much between each business. I think it is just generally that we've seen a real speeding up in consumer trends in terms of moving online. So if you're well placed online, then it's great. If you're not, it's very challenging to adapt to that. and make the right investments, and particularly if cash flow is a challenge. But I think, yeah, it's a tricky one. It's the optimistic side of things is very difficult to say. I suppose that in the mid to long term, I hope as well, we probably have a more empathetic style of management in terms of understanding work-life balance, and I suppose the challenges that you can have homeschooling or those sorts of things, which I think has changed attitudes generally in terms of the way we work. But it's difficult to tell, I say, at the moment, of the real sort of shining things, because it's a little bit early, and particularly with Brexit and trying to understand what the impacts that is going to have on the country. It's a little bit early to say, in my opinion.
Laura, do you have anything to share on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of opportunities, yes, it is going to be different to every organisation. I think some of the ways that we've always looked at growth still hold true. So in terms of innovating in different spaces outside of online, I think being able to leverage the trends and underlying trends, those have been in existence, to be perfectly honest, for decades. How they show up is very different. But all of the trends have purely been accelerated through COVID. The only new one that's come through, which is not surprising, is this degree of protection and the need for hygiene and reassurance. But all of the other trends, whether it's around wellness, whether it's around resilience, I don't mean just pandemic, I also mean environmental and climate change, that we're facing such huge variety in terms of from absolutely freezing to almost desert temperatures. How can we actually help people to adapt to that? All of those things will only set us up for success going forward. Now, that's been true, to be honest, across the board. One of the new areas, I think, is around what is the risk assessment? So if you look at where the gaps are that have become very evident through this pandemic, if there are not immediate resources to fulfill that, looking at different ways of doing things. So it could be through trial. So for example, in COTY, we didn't have a direct to consumer offering at all. While the stores in the UK were open, you couldn't actually buy makeup because the stores closed that part off, because they obviously had other priorities and they didn't want to be merchandising that side of the store. But actually trying out some very small scale direct to consumer and doing a sort of do, learn, do. So I think there are different ways that you can approach some of these opportunities. You can also look externally. It's not all about internal. You can look at third parties, etc. So I think there are ways of, one, don't think because of the pandemic that we're in, everything gets thrown out the window. I think some of the things absolutely continue to leverage, as I said, the trends, the ongoing consumer engagement, but the new things, perhaps there's a different style of assessing what a risk is and how you lean into some of these opportunities so that you can actually perhaps drive even more opportunity and growth.
I really like that idea. I mean, do you think that there is a possibility that some organizations have become less risk averse, more risk averse as a result of what they've experienced over the last few months?
I think from a cash flow perspective, there is greater risk aversion because it is about managing. So those who are really tightly managing. However, all businesses are used to, I'm not sure that I really like this analogy, but flying the plane while we're building it. But we're used to the idea of you can't just sort out where you are today, because where you are today might not be where the marketplace is tomorrow. So you've always got to lean forward. So I think on that assessment, there is a degree of let's actually embrace outside of our four walls or virtual four walls, that we can actually look externally for inspiration. And I'm seeing a lot more of that in businesses that have never done that before. So they're starting to dip their toe into that. And actually there's so much that they can give, but there's also so much that they can benefit from, because it's just different ways of doing things that actually just takes you out of your comfort zone, but into a place that actually might jump you forward in terms of opportunities. So yes, I do see that. I do see more risk coming in terms of not just looking at our immediate little protectionism, but I think it is down to where companies are leaning forward is there is still that cost element to it, that there is some nervousness, understandably.
Definitely. And I think it comes back to what, Neil, you were talking about earlier with the adaptability and the lessons learned in that area as well. What do you think? I mean, we've got a couple of questions in the box, so we'll move on to those shortly. But just before we do, in terms of businesses that are, I guess they've got their recovery plans in place, and at some point they're going to have to start moving away from recovery and thinking about growth. How can they make that jump? How do they know when they're ready to do that? Neil, I wonder if you've got any thoughts.
I guess for a lot of it's almost it really depends on how the business is trading. So I think the first thing is you've got to get through that survival mode and have enough cash flow through that you can cover your overheads. It sounds very basic, but it's getting through that point. If you can secure survival, financing to invest. I think previous recessions has kind of told us that the people that can afford to invest through a recession come out the other side stronger. So I think it really does come back to cash flow and financing in the short term of how you prepare for it. I think there's also a good point of reflection for the people that I know, that they've told me who are struggling a lot more, is it's a point of having some harsh realities to look at your business. I think this is forcing businesses, as you've seen, to take decisions that they may have, you've seen it with some of the banks and some of the high street retailers, but it's much broader than that. Businesses that are looking and saying, actually, have we been as hard in some of the organizational or investment decisions that we've made, and having to really focus on what is the core part of the business. And I think that, as cold as it sounds, does offer them the ability to be leaner and stronger out of the other side of it. In the short term, that's not great for the people that lose out of it, but it does, I think, for the businesses, perhaps give them, it forces their hand of things that they may not have done in the past. I think it's really forcing businesses to focus in what is the core part of their offering and focusing on that. I think there is also an opportunity to reconnect with their customers and really understand what they want from them and how they differentiate themselves, where they perhaps have lost some of their historic differentiators. A lot of companies talk about having customer insight and being customer focused. I don't think many of them really live that honestly and take decisions that are truly focused on the direction of the customer. It's always a balance, because obviously you can't do everything for the customer and forget the fact running a business and it needs to be viable and profitable and meet shareholder needs. But I think there is a real advantage to taking that view and getting the insight and using that to drive the decisions you make around your business. And I think that needs to be a permanent shift, because trends are changing and they're speeding up. So you need the flexibility in your organization, but you need that steer to come to understand the consumer trends and how quickly they're changing. Because, if you go back 30, 40 years, it may have taken, I think you see the adoption curve in technology, don't you? I forget it's the sort of how long it took for a telephone to get to 1 billion users, and it took decades. And then you get to the point of some of the recent apps like TikTok, which took a couple of months. And that, I think, is the same of consumer trends as well. The shift is going to be much quicker, and that means that businesses really need to think about how they get that insight to pick those trends up early, but also then what that means operationally for how they're going to shift and change their operating model, because you've got this constant cycle, and I've seen it as well. So companies that when I started working with startups are now teenagers, and they're starting to get disrupted by the newbies, the new startups coming in, because they've started to get slow and their technology is not great and they've lost contact with their consumers. So there's this constant cycle where you need to be on the top of your game and constantly learning and evolving your organization, your offering. Otherwise, there's going to be a new generation coming in and they'll do it for you.
Constant evolving there. So we've got a few minutes left. I'm just going to jump onto the Q&A that we have that's come through. So we have a question here from Tom Loader. So Tom, thank you for sending this in. He asks, do you think demand for more flexible working conditions will continue post-COVID? Laurie, I'll come to you first.
So I do see that finally the idea of flexible working, and it doesn't matter where you are as long as you're delivering and not even perhaps within the same time zone. I think that finally is starting to come through. Having for many years worked at home, this was probably about 10 or so years ago, people couldn't really understand it. So I do think so. I think there is still value in both, and people are really starting to appreciate it. So Neil mentioned earlier, there's some people who cannot work at home. So whether that's obviously the current situation that you've got children that you're homeschooling, or whether you're a flat share or something, you don't have the ability to work at home. However, there is a role for both. The office or a work environment, perhaps not an office, that plays, I think, a really key role. I've seen Zoom calls are great for being productive, for going through timelines and everyone sort of checking in on each other as to how things are going. But having tried to lead a couple of ideation workshops, it is not the right environment, or certainly not the most efficient. You've got one person who can talk at a time. You haven't got the ability to sort of bounce off of each other. You haven't got the idea that you're all in the same room, that you've got stimulus around you, that you're able to foster those discussions and also foster those relationships, as Neil mentioned. So I think the work environment still plays quite a key role. It helps to disseminate information. It helps to create those relationships. It helps for ideation. But then there is also a time that actually being able to just crack on and do what you need to do. Or, why do you go into an office to have a meeting when it's literally a checkpoint? You could do that over a Zoom call. You don't physically have to be together. So I think the idea of flexible and hybrid, I can certainly see that going forward. And also working hours to some degree. We'll never get around time zones. That's always going to be our challenge. So, we're still going to have silly o'clock to get China or Australia, etc. But yes, I do think that businesses will start to embrace it. I hope also that they do. I think the race back to normal, hopefully, as I said before, that doesn't mean a race back to the habits that we had before, that we start to actually take on board where the benefits are that we can get from this hybrid. I'd see it as a hybrid kind of solution, as long as you can make it work for your teams, because again, to try and coordinate that not everyone is together at any point in time is equally a challenge.
Comes back to the empathetic management concept.
Exactly. A very different management that's required going forward, definitely.
Definitely. We've got one more question, so I'll just speed through that quickly, and Neil, I'll come to you. This is from Anonymous. So how can we integrate sustainability into our recovery plans? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's, I suppose, consciously thinking about what that means for your business. So for us, where we sell physical products, it's very much looking at our supply chain, and I suppose adapting to the shift in the consumer trends that we should be removing plastic from everything we possibly can. So that then forces you to go out and go, right, actually, if demand for that, if that's a trend that's emerging, then hopefully the costs of doing that for everybody should reduce as the volumes increase. So I think it's consciously going out and seeking those to adapt to the changing trend. And I think something I also talked about is locally sourcing as much as possible, because I think that helps with the logistics of the supply chain. But often you can find that if you're looking hard enough, that you can find suppliers that at an equivalent cost that you can find something that's locally sourced that has less of a carbon footprint, hasn't traveled so far. And that has benefits, I think, in terms of the speed of being able to adopt to the change, because you can bring new products online quicker and you can get them to customers quicker. And I think and there's a number of trends as well. So we see in the US that actually people still want this, the online retail is still set by Amazon in terms of the benchmark, in terms of not wanting to pay for delivery and wanting everything yesterday. So again, that leans itself to actually working with partners that are more local to the geography of your customer base as well. So there's benefits for that. So I think it's looking at all of that, and I think the consumer insight about people actually thinking more consciously about the environment gives you fuel internally, because I think we will soon get to the point increasingly where it does change consumer behavior and buying patterns, and therefore the commercial case for having that as part of your proposition, it may even become, in not too distant future, a hygiene factor, that people will be dissuaded from purchasing if you aren't conscious about it. And that change in consumer buying patterns actually is a big business case for a lot of businesses. So I'd say listen to that.
Absolutely. Well, sadly, time is up. So Neil and Laurie, thank you so much for your contributions and your thoughts that you've shared.